One sentence. That is all it took. Not a gesture. Not a confrontation. Not the kind of extended back and forth that builds visibly over multiple innings until it finally boils over in the ninth. Just one sentence, calm, measured, delivered in the understated way that Shohei Ohtani delivers almost everything, that set off a chain of events so volatile, so rapidly escalating, so completely out of proportion to what triggered them, that by the time the dust settled, two Marlins players were standing on a baseball field expressing their fury at a ruling they believed was built on favoritism. And Will Smith was somewhere behind them, done with the restraint that professional athletes are trained to maintain in these moments, saying words that cut through all of the careful media language and landed with the blunt force of someone who had watched the facts get twisted one too many times. They're twisting the facts. 4 words. Simple. Direct. Furious. But to understand why those 4 words matter, why Smith's fury was not just defensiveness but something closer to principle, why the umpire's ruling sent 2 Marlins players into visible dissatisfaction, why a single comment from Ohtani on the mound became the ignition point for one of the most talked about incidents of the season, you have to go back to the beginning. Back to the mound. Back to the comment. Back to the moment when a baseball game became something considerably more complicated than a baseball game. Context matters in baseball more than in almost any other sport. A pitch that is borderline in the first inning reads completely differently in the 7th with runners on base and a 1-run lead. A word exchanged between players that would be unremarkable in the 3rd inning lands like an accusation in the 8th. Baseball is a sport where meaning is always situational, where the same action, the same gesture, the same sentence carries completely different weight depending on where it falls in the arc of a game. When Ohtani made the comment that triggered everything, the situation was already charged. This was not a casual mid-game exchange between competitors who were loosely connected to the flow of events. This was a moment of specific competitive tension, a moment where what was being said, and who was saying it, and who was listening, all mattered in ways that extended beyond the words themselves. Ohtani's comment was not aggressive. Everyone who has watched him long enough understands that aggression is simply not part of his competitive vocabulary. He does not chirp at opposing players. He does not engage in the psychological warfare that some athletes use as weapons. His competitive intensity is almost entirely internal, directed inward toward his own preparation and execution rather than outward toward the people trying to beat him. But the comment existed. It was heard. And somewhere in the Marlins' positioning on that field, in the way their center fielder and second baseman processed what they had just heard from the most famous player in baseball, something shifted. What followed was not baseball anymore. It was a response. Personal, physical, and dangerous. The word dangerous is not used carelessly here. In professional baseball, the line between aggressive and dangerous is one that players and umpires and league officials monitor with the seriousness it deserves. Aggressive is acceptable. Aggressive is part of competition. Hard slides, tight pitches, the physical proximity that comes with playing a contact-adjacent sport at the highest level, these are understood and accepted as part of the game's fabric. Dangerous is different. Dangerous means that something happened that crossed the line between competitive intensity and conduct that put someone at physical risk. Dangerous means that an umpire felt compelled to make a ruling. Dangerous means that the league's institutional machinery, the apparatus that exists specifically to adjudicate these situations and determine their consequences, was engaged. The Marlins center fielder and second baseman crossed that line. What happened on that mound, the nature of the foul, the physical specifics of what was directed at a situation involving Ohtani, was captured in enough detail that the umpire's ruling was not a matter of interpretation. It was a matter of what had occurred and what the rulebook said about it. The ruling was made public. And that is when everything escalated further. When an umpire makes a ruling in a situation like this one, when the ruling is significant enough to be documented, communicated formally, and released publicly, it is because what happened was significant enough to require that level of institutional response. Umpires do not escalate casually. They are trained to de-escalate, to manage the emotional temperature of a baseball game that can rise quickly in moments of physical and competitive tension. They are given tools and authority specifically because their primary function is to keep the game moving forward through situations that would otherwise stop it entirely. When the umpire's ruling in this situation was made public, it was a statement. Not just about what had happened on that mound, but about where the line was, and the fact that it had been crossed. The Marlins center fielder and second baseman received that statement differently than it was intended. Rather than the acknowledgement that the ruling called for, the institutional acceptance of a judgment made by an authorized official who had witnessed the incident directly, what came back from the two Marlins players was dissatisfaction. Vocal, public, and built around an argument that would become the central flashpoint of the entire incident. Don't play favorites against Shohei. 5 words that reframed the entire conversation. Because what the Marlins players were alleging, whether they believed it fully or were reaching for justification in the heat of the moment, was that the umpire's ruling was not a neutral application of the rulebook to what had occurred. It was favoritism. Preferential treatment for the most famous player in the sport. A thumb on the scale that tilted justice toward Ohtani simply because of who Ohtani is. This is an argument that requires serious engagement. Not because it is necessarily true, but because it is the kind of argument that, once made publicly, demands a response. Let us take the Marlins players' argument seriously, because dismissing it without examination would be intellectually dishonest. The claim is this: Ohtani receives preferential treatment from umpires and league officials because of his status. Because of who he is globally, because of what he means commercially and culturally to Major League Baseball, the institutional structures of the sport bend in his favor in ways they would not bend for a less prominent player. This is not an argument without precedent in professional sports. There is a long history of debates about whether superstars receive favorable calls, in basketball, in football, in baseball. The argument has been made about dominant players across multiple generations of every major sport. It is not invented from nothing. But in this specific situation, it does not hold. Here is why. The umpire's ruling was based on what happened on that mound. It was based on a physical incident that was witnessed directly and documented specifically. It was not a judgment call in the sense of a borderline pitch or a close play at a base, the kinds of calls where human subjectivity genuinely enters the picture and where arguments about bias have at least a structural foothold. It was a ruling about conduct. About whether what the Marlins center fielder and second baseman did crossed the line that the rulebook draws between competitive aggression and dangerous behavior. They crossed it. The umpire ruled accordingly. The ruling was made public with the transparency that serious incidents require. Calling that favoritism is not an argument about the ruling. It is a deflection from the conduct that produced it. And then came Will Smith. There are moments in sports controversies where someone in the middle of it, a player, a coach, a veteran voice who has watched the situation develop from inside the dugout, reaches a threshold. Where the careful management of public statements gives way to something more direct. Where the gap between what is being said publicly and what actually happened becomes wide enough that someone decides to close it. Smith reached that threshold. They're twisting the facts. This is not a complicated statement. It does not hedge. It does not leave room for multiple interpretations or acknowledge the legitimacy of competing perspectives. It is a direct accusation, made publicly, on the record, with the full understanding that it would be reported and circulated and debated. Smith was saying that the Marlins players' favoritism argument was not a good faith disagreement about the umpire's ruling. It was a deliberate misrepresentation of what had occurred. A reframing of an incident, one that began with a dangerous foul directed at a situation involving Ohtani, as a story about institutional bias rather than a story about conduct that warranted exactly the ruling it received. The fury in Smith's statement is important to understand correctly. It was not the fury of someone defending a superstar teammate out of loyalty or self-interest. It was the fury of someone who had watched an incident unfold from proximity, who knew what Ohtani had said and how he had said it and what had followed, and who was now watching that incident be publicly mischaracterized by the people who had caused it. Fury at dishonesty is different from fury at being challenged. Smith was not angry that the Marlins players had opinions. He was angry that their opinions were built on a foundation that did not match reality. They're twisting the facts. For words that said everything the longer statements could not. Step back from the specific details of the incident. The comment, the dangerous foul, the umpire's ruling, the Marlins players' dissatisfaction, Smith's explosion. Step back far enough to see what this entire sequence of events reveals about where Shohei Ohtani exists in the landscape of professional baseball right now. He is beyond the ordinary dynamics of competition. This sounds like hyperbole. It is not. What it means specifically is this: Ohtani's presence in any situation, on the mound, at the plate, in the dugout, even in the peripheral moments between plays where casual comments are exchanged, carries a weight and generates a reaction that ordinary player presence does not. When he speaks, people respond differently than they would respond to most players. Not because of arrogance or provocation on his part, he provides neither, but because of what he represents. Because of the commercial stakes attached to his performance and his health. Because of the global audience that follows him. Because of the fact that anything involving Ohtani immediately becomes bigger than a standard baseball incident. The Marlins players understood this on some level. Their favoritism argument, whatever its validity, was built on the implicit acknowledgement that Ohtani occupies a different position than other players. That rulings involving him carry different institutional weight. That the game treats him differently. What they misidentified was the source of that difference. It is not favoritism. It is consequence. The consequences of crossing lines in situations involving Ohtani are more visible, more documented, and more publicly scrutinized than the consequences of crossing the same lines in situations involving less prominent players. That visibility is not protection. It is pressure, on everyone involved, including Ohtani himself. The umpire's ruling was not favorable to Ohtani. It was accurate. The distinction matters enormously. At the center of all of it, the dangerous foul, the umpire's ruling, the Marlins players' dissatisfaction, Smith's furious 4 words, was one man who said one thing and then went back to competing. Ohtani's comment was the ignition point. But what it ignited revealed something far more important than the incident itself. It revealed how 2 Marlins players respond when a ruling goes against them, not with accountability but with deflection. With an argument about favoritism that reframes their own conduct as someone else's institutional bias. With the public complaint that the most famous player in baseball receives protection that other players do not. It revealed how Will Smith responds when facts are twisted in front of him, directly, forcefully, without the carefully managed language that professional sports usually demands in these moments. And it revealed, once again, something that this season keeps demonstrating in different ways through different incidents and different situations. That Shohei Ohtani's presence makes everything bigger. Every moment more scrutinized. Every incident more consequential. Every ruling more debated. He did not ask for any of that. He made a comment, calm, measured, understated, exactly as he delivers everything, and the game around him erupted in response. The umpire ruled correctly. Smith told the truth. And the 2 Marlins players who stood on that field complaining about favoritism will need to reckon, eventually, privately, honestly, with the fact that the incident began not with the ruling but with the foul. The dangerous one. The one they chose to commit. One comment from Ohtani. One chain reaction from everyone else. That is the truth that no amount of twisting can change.